and I will be your chair for this evening's conversation. This evening's conversation has been titled Migration and Development, Conceptualizing Venezuelan Immigration in Trinidad and Tobago. This conversation is being hosted by the Trade and Economic Development Unit, TEDU for short, at the University of the West Indies. For some time, the TEDU has been using its national conversation platform as a forum to facilitate engagement between experts on the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. The objective of these conversations is to ensure that the public is informed of critical information on and analysis of the economy in a timely manner. Much of the scholarship concerning migration and development is focused on sending countries, typically developing nations. Here, the key issue is whether or not the benefits of remittances exceed the losses related to the brain drain. However, while we in Trinidad and Tobago have navigated these issues since our independence, at present, we have a very different and unique challenge facing us. That is the Venezuelan migration to Trinidad and Tobago. This brings us to our motivating question for this evening's conversation. How do we conceptualize the Venezuelan immigration? To answer this question, we look to our panelists. On our panel this evening, we have first, retired Major Richard Lynch, a national security consultant, Dr. Michelle Rice, migration and diaspora consultant, Dr. Roger Hussein, senior economist at the UE and coordinator of the TEDU, Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, retired director of the Institute of International Relations at UE, and Dr. Buendalat Tiwari, former Minister of Planning and both the former principal and pro-vice chancellor of the UE. So just a few meeting announcements before we begin. Please ensure that your microphones are muted so that when you, please ensure that your microphones are muted when you're not speaking to prevent feedback. And also note that this session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. The structure of this evening's conversation will be as follows. We will begin with a presentation by retired Major Lynch, followed by a contribution from Dr. Rice. Next, we will invite questions from our remaining panelists, Drs. Hussein, Gonzalez, and Tiwari. And finally, we'll invite questions and comments from you, our audience, either verbally or using the Zoom chat box. So now we invite our retired Major Lynch to begin with his opening presentation. Major Lynch? Sorry, Major Lynch, your microphone is muted.
Yes. Okay, great. Good evening to all. This is certainly an honor and a privilege to join you in this important discussion. As you would have outlined, Christian, since our independence, we've been treating with this question of migration, and particularly in relation to development. I do have one slide that I'm going to include now on the shared screen that will form the basis of my presentation. I'm going to try to get through this, well, to some extent as quickly as I can so that we could get to the Q&A in that context. So let me just work towards sharing the screen now. Please confirm to me whether you are seeing a screen.
Yes, we are seeing your screen right now.
Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
All right. So
sorry, Major Lynch, if you could just put it on presentation view. So
yeah, sure.
The screen. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. So I first came into contact with this particular model while back in the military. Our current ambassador to Washington, Ambassador Anthony Philip Spencer, who was then Chief of Defense Staff. I was senior staff officer to him, and some years ago we were tasked as part of an interministerial committee to which he would have chaired to develop a national security policy and strategy. So the first time I would have seen this was on the basis of some significant deliberations several years ago on a whiteboard with some markers. But it stayed with me, and particularly in my preparation for this discussion, I thought that I would introduce it to the public, certainly with his permission. and apply it in the context within which I intend to speak on this issue. Now,
excuse me. Sorry, I am sorry to very sorry to interrupt you, but the screen that we are seeing is not quite filling the screen.
Oh,
I think that's
what's causing that. Let me figure out.
Sorry, just one. Yeah.
Myself, I'm not too particularly sure why.
What is causing it?
Oh.
Okay, perhaps if you could stop perhaps ending the slideshow might allow us to see it. It will go back to what it was before, which should give us a better opportunity. So we can work with it. Yeah.
We can work with it this way. Okay.
Yeah. Apologies. Okay.
Yeah. So essentially, the presupposition upon which I'm going to go through this slide is that states should apply any policy on migration on the basis of its development strategy, and the extent to which the policy and strategy for development is located within some kind of coherent model that focuses on governance as well as strategic guidance. Now, if we look at the first two iterations of this slide, identity and ideology, I want to suggest for our consideration, firstly, that countries that have focused particularly on this question of development and more extensively in its relationship to migration, they have evolved or developed an ideology and an identity as much as they are a geography. By way of a few examples, the United States of America, for instance, when you think about the US as a country, the US presents for us an ideology and certainly an identity. And if you think about it, even us, those who are not necessarily citizens of the United States, this idea that you can pursue happiness or the pursuit of liberty, which is quite inherent in their own constitution, focuses quite intensely on the question of this franchise called citizenship. It pursues a particular idea of what it is to be a citizen of the country beyond simply its definition in terms of geographical terms. In my preparation for this, I looked at as well the UK, which was quite an interesting model. The UK, from my own understanding, doesn't have a written constitution. But the idea of what it is to be British, it seems quite known, certainly to UK citizens, because it's really a combination of identity and ideology, which focuses more on the cultural aspect of the definition of a state. And that is the norms and the values and so on that a state considers to be a part of what it is to be a citizen of that state. And there are several other examples. China, for instance, the One China policy is far more than a geographical definition of China. It speaks to the way they approach their foreign policy. It speaks to the type of diplomacy, the type of investment, and the very definition of who they are as a people. Recently, I was listening to a description on Paul Kagame and the development that he is doing in Rwanda. And someone referred to the Rwanda as the Singapore of Africa. And I thought that was an interesting description because, again, Singapore represents more than a geography. It speaks to a particular identity or a culture of the society that the person was talking about in relation to describing Rwanda. So that this question of national identity and national ideology, I want to suggest for consideration is an important part of this question of national development. And we will see later on in relation to issues like migration. Canada was another model that I looked at particularly. And I looked at Canada because when we were working on this national security policy and strategy, we looked at the Canadian Constitution only to discover that multiculturalism was a key feature of the Constitution. And again, it speaks to a question of the idea of who Canada is as a country. And why that is so important is because one of the things we had to look at, particularly in Trinidad and Tobago's case, is the extent to which we are clear as a society in terms of our identity and our ideology. What do we mean by multiculturalism? It's a word that we've been using quite a lot. And in the context of what migration is offering to us, this question of where does multiculturalism locate itself in terms of our national identity and ideology. And one of the fundamental questions that we asked ourselves back then, and certainly is pertinent today, is multiculturalism a process of a cultural melting pot in which we all came from different parts of the world to be a part of this society, and that our identity and our ideology is really to divorce oneself from the parts of the world that you came from and its culture, and form a new hybrid culture that doesn't exist purely as the sum total of all the cultural origins that are located here? Or is it that multiculturalism for us is really a process of coexistence among different ethnic and cultural groups on the principles of tolerance and mutual respect and so on? Now, why is this important? It is important because when we begin to think about this question of migration, and within recent times, Venezuelan migration, it begs the question as to what type of identity or ideology we are developing towards as a society, looking at issues like multiculturalism and coexistence of different groups on the basis of the principles of mutual respect and coexistence and tolerance and so on. But if a society is essentially defined by ideology and identity, it certainly would not be enough for us to govern the society. And which is why the very first green slide, item on the slide, speaks to the interests of the state. Now, I'm speaking here specifically to the enduring interests of the state. If it is that we define ourselves or we identify ourselves a particular way, and we identify with a particular culture that it is to be a particular society or a state, then the pursuit of our enduring interests should be an outcome of that. What are those enduring interests of the state that transcends political cycles, for instance, or transcends political administrations? What are the interests, the enduring interests of the state that transcends generations? And that's another area that we are going to have to look at when we begin to talk about this question of Venezuelan migration, because the extent to which Venezuelan migrants are a part of the intergenerational development of Trinidad and Tobago requires some consideration and certainly governance in the context of public policy and so on. Now, as we move further along the slide, it separates into two very important items, that of integration and secondly, institutions. Now, this is important, and it's important because the question of migration has to be located within the context of what are we asking our institutions of governance and public policy to do in relation to migration as it pertains to our development. Now, before I continue in that context, I want to present a conceptual framework within which I'm doing this. I am describing policy as essentially an instrument of governance, but I am describing strategy as an instrument of guidance, and I am introducing plans as an instrument for implementation. And one of the things I am certainly convinced of is that there are too many instances in which we are trying to implement policy without the development of strategic instruments that guides the development of policy, or more so guides the development of plans towards the implementation of policy directives. And that leads to an important appropriation of the institutions of governance and public policy. Because if you look at the other side, which is integration, there is a multi-directional relationship between the state's enduring interests and the state's imperatives, the instruments, and the implementation of the state. Now, if we look at integration in its purest term, it speaks to the coherence or the convergence between what we say and what we do. So that if we declare our state's enduring interests, the extent to which our enduring interests are integrated with our imperatives as a state, our instruments as a state, and certainly what we implement as a state, then it aligns our institutions, or it defines the role and functions of our institutions in relation to the state's enduring interests. Now, why is this important to this whole question of migration in relation to development? One of the things that Ambassador Philip Spencer attempted to do in this particular model is he graded to what extent there's a level of implementation or realization. So, for instance, the green items on the slide speaks to a measure of 50 to 100% implementation, while the two orange slides, which speaks to identity and ideology, speaks to about 25 to 50% maturation in terms of who we are as a society. And then 0 to 25% speaks to the question of implementation. Now, this is important because the question of what we implement in relation to Venezuelan migration or any kind of migration, particularly in relation to development, brings this question of a model for development into serious consideration. And that to me is extremely important, because you have to, in my mind, locate the question of migration, and more so integration of migrants, or your position on migrants, within some model of how the country is to be developed. Now, this is also important for migrants themselves, and allow me to use an example in this regard. When we think about the idea or the ideology, as well as the identity of, let's say, a country like the United States of America, this question of the pursuit of happiness or the pursuit of liberty is essentially a political process. The extent to which, for instance, a migrant leaves his or her country to go to the United States of America, or even Trinidad, the question of why are they coming here and why not somewhere else? If it is that they are seeing Trinidad and Tobago as a place where they could pursue some version of happiness, we in Trinidad and Tobago, or even in the case of the United States, as I was giving the example before, there should be a clear sense of where the pursuit of the happiness or liberty or freedoms of migrants are located within the liberties, freedoms, and freedoms that are afforded to our citizens, and the extent to which the process of appropriating migrants rests within that regard. For example, the question of migrants to the US or even Trinidad and Tobago, I think it's important for us to begin to think through issues as to what extent is national development in pursuit of security, certainly the economy, healthcare, and education. And why is that important? I think it's important in our national development models because the appropriation of migrants is centered around, to my mind, those same issues. The extent to which a migrant is in need of security, in need of healthcare, in need of education, and certainly in need of economic viability, is both true for migrants as well as citizens of the country. And this is where the convergence between migration and development resides. The extent to which our understanding of our identity and certainly our ideology informs our enduring interests, and the extent to which institutions are delivering on security, on healthcare, on the economy, on education, appropriates where we locate our migrants in relation to the development and the quality of lives of our own citizenry. And so the question of policy prescriptions or strategies, which are instruments of governance and guidance, redounds into plans for implementation in relation to the convergence between development and migration, to me, essentially begins with who we are as a people and why we are who we are as a people. And appropriate issues like the extent to which every creed and race should find an equal place, and what is the process by which that finding takes place, not only for citizens, but also for migrants. And it also speaks to the question of providing policy directions to our institutions. For instance, one of the things that I have looked at with this whole question of migration and its relation to issues like COVID-19 is the extent to which migration and COVID-19 and recent multidimensional threats to the security of our country is renegotiating the contract between the citizen and the state. We have arrived at a point where the state, for instance, is pursuing measures, and that's not just for us, this is a global reality, that the restriction of the movement of persons within the country, an unusual level of restriction, and unusual restrictions as it pertains to attire, we all have to wear a mask by way of legislation, is a renegotiation of this question of individual rights and liberty and freedom and state security in the interest of the collective safety and security of all of us. And that too is another example of where migration fits into the mix, the extent to which the question of the rights, or more so the question of the movement of migrants within the framework of the state's architecture on the security of the country in the middle of a pandemic or in the middle of other issues are extremely important. Now, in closing, I want to also outline that I think what's important for us is to continue this question of political process. Because, and when I speak about politically, I'm not speaking specifically about party politics. I'm talking more generally about the society's participation and contribution to this question of national identity and ideology, and the extent to which our participation in that process provides the kind of policy directives that are born out of a clear sense of what our enduring interests are. And that transcends the extent to which, for instance, political administrations can move, can transcend in the midst of an enduring threat like the situation that has emerged in the Republic of Venezuela, and as well as issues like COVID-19 and so on. These threats or these realities, they do not respect or confine themselves to political cycles. And that's why the importance of enduring interests and the extent to which enduring interests are informing the way we structure and resource our institutions to pursue our enduring interests in the pursuit of a particular quality of life on the basis of our ideology and identity. So I'm going to stop there for now as far as the presentation is concerned, and give way certainly for my colleague to give comments, and then we will treat with the question of the Q&A after. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Lynch. Next, we'd like to invite Dr. Rice to comment or give her remarks. Dr. Rice?
So I wasn't sure what angle we were going to be operating from, so I'll just jump right off from the last presentation. So the first thing I want to say is, in contexts such as ours, where we are a multicultural, multi-ethnic country that receives 1/3 of the overall Caribbean stock, the flow of migrants, Trinidad and Tobago is a recipient country for that 1/3 of that overall stock. Over the years, what we have found, this has been our perspective, is that even though we are a country that receives large migration flows from other neighboring countries and further afield, we have not had a conversation about migration. Migration has not been placed on the front burner, nor has it been placed on the front burner as a political issue, and neither has it been seriously considered in terms of how we want to posit our development process and charting a path forward. So I just want to say that in instances like this, particularly in response to xenophobic statements or people's lack of knowledge about the migration landscape, particularly in relation to Venezuelans and other Latin American migrants who find themselves here, I think it's necessary that we sort of historicize the process. So we would find that way before our independence period, we were grappling with this issue. And this is primarily because of our geographical proximity, our location as a gateway to the Americas. So we have had waves of Venezuelan migration that far exceeds or predates any notion of independence. As early as 1000 BC, the first Meso-Indians would have traveled from the Orinoco, making their way into Trinidad and then making their way up the chain of islands. And if we look at a more contemporary period, I remember the early 2000s when people were reacting to the number of Venezuelan students that were coming here during the Chavez era. I had written a paper on the Chavez effect, exile, and looking at Venezuelan migrants in Trinidad. And in historicizing the process, I identified about 6 major waves of Venezuelan migration to Trinidad. That had nothing to do with any of the contexts that we know now. So the first one is a long history of Venezuelan revolutionaries fleeing wars and dictatorships and coming to Trinidad. They came to Trinidad mainly as a refuge, and our cemeteries are littered with some of these patriots who died here. And as a matter of fact, Trinidad and Tobago played a major role in the Liberation War. So we had at one point about 4 of the 5 top generals residing periodically in Trinidad. And I think if people knew this history, they would know that we are inexorably linked to Venezuela and to the mainland by extension by dint of history, culture, geography, geology, culture, and a number of other factors. After that initial wave of Venezuelan revolutionaries, we would have had a smaller number of Sephardic Jews who came here in the 1790s to the early 1800s, and they primarily settled in and around Woodbrook and the environs. So we see a pattern that's repeating itself. So perhaps most of what we're experiencing with contemporary Venezuelan migration to Trinidad has some sort of historical basis several centuries prior. The one that stands out the most in terms of the most numerous Venezuelan migrants or flows would have been what we colloquially call the cocoa payols. These are the people that came primarily to support a dying cocoa industry, and to that we have to be very grateful, right? The other wave, I call that the 4th wave, would have been a slew of urban aristocrats, wealthy, well-to-do Venezuelans that settled in Trinidad, and they were always very nomadic because, again, of the distance, they moved back and forth. Some of them actually resided on islands off Trinidad, and so they traveled by boat, right, and moved back and forth. Later on, you would have had some of those people who had their children being schooled in the Catholic convents and colleges of the capital. And this continued into maybe, it stopped somewhere around the passing of the Common Entrance Act, where we had a steady flow of boarders into convents. So that was another wave. And then we would have had the wave of Venezuelan students and other people who came who were suffering from the downturn in the economy under Chavez. So the 7th major wave would be what we're experiencing now. And so if we look at it in the context, Venezuelans have always come here and Trinidadians have always gone to Venezuela. Those flows have been bidirectional. And a lot of it has been shaped by political turmoil and upheaval and the socio-economic circumstances of the time. So the only thing that has changed is really the context for people coming, for us going in the 1980s when there was a lot of economic difficulty here, and a lot of Trinidadians would have gone over, worked in the oil industry there and found their way there. And so when we look at it from that point of view, we see that it really is nothing new. There are a number of other factors that, again, there may be contemporary issues that we're dealing with now, but we find some historical basis for them many years or even centuries prior. The other thing is the idea of managing these borders. We spoke about migration and development, and if we look at the IOM model speaks about managing migration flows in recognition that people are more nomadic, more mobile than ever, and globalization has contributed to that process over the years. So that it's very, very difficult to close your borders entirely, but it allows for you to filter migrants and decide who you want to come in and who you do not want to come in. And so we've seen many countries adopt policies, whether it's Canada or Australia, where you have a point system, and that allows you to establish criteria for allowing people to come in. What that means is that you have some notion of what your country should look like, what you would like to achieve in terms of the development strategies, and that allows you to craft your migration policy to suit. So when we are not having an active discussion about migration, when migration statistics are treated as top security information, and researchers and academics don't readily have access to that information, it makes it very difficult to formulate policy when you are using numbers that are being bandied about or you're using estimates. And we have to remember too that Venezuelans are not the only migrants that we have here, whether they are legal or illegal. Trinidad and Tobago, somewhere around the 90s, would have had a huge influx of people from very varied parts of the world seeking entry here. And one of the flyers pulled off of one of the boats bringing in people had a lot of erroneous information, but they also had one correct thing they had was the demographic breakdown. So we become a pole of attraction, not only for the economics, not only because people know that they could find jobs, but because it is easier for them to blend in and assimilate into the society. So we have large numbers of migrants from various parts, various African countries, from India, from China, from the Middle East, and now from Venezuela again. So it's just actually the old groups that make up, the old ethnic groups that make up our population. We are seeing more recent flows with the same demographic breakdown repopulating our shores. So that's the first thing that I want to say. The other thing is, you mentioned the pandemic, and this is perhaps one of the reasons why we needed to be a little more proactive. I felt that when we were on the verge of a humanitarian crisis, we had not yet had a response. So thankfully, at least 2 years ago, we had the exercise to register Venezuelan migrants, and that is pending cabinet approval for an extension into 2021. But before we get there, one of the things that I guess we have not spoken about or thought about is, as you mentioned, this whole idea of identity. And if we go back to Eric Williams and his history of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, it leaves a lot of food for thought, because identity is a complex issue in countries as heterogeneous as ours. It is extremely difficult to pinpoint what that identity is. Sure, we have some common denominators that unify us, but the diversity is what makes us a rich, fertile country. And Eric Williams said even then that we seem not to be able to have that cohesive sort of identity. And so that we were always on a series of populations living side by side. And there was reference to the many, if you go back to Bridget Brereton, and I like to use history to inform the process, particularly in our case, because we're still a relatively young nation, you look at the ways in which it is a lot more complex and diverse than some of the other neighboring islands, because even among the European population, you had about 12 different nationalities here. And with that, you had differences in religion and so on. And so all of these go into a very complex issue and make it extremely difficult. So I think I just want to close by talking about our response to dealing with migration flows from Venezuela in light of the pandemic. And I know a lot has been said in terms of comparison with larger countries and what they're doing. But we have to remember that we're working with a figure of about 60,000, those are the guesstimates, 60,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago. That does not really paint a picture of all the other groups who are seeking asylum and the other international migrants that we have on our soil. So it is difficult to compare, I can't say apples and oranges. We're dealing with cherries and maybe, I don't know, a soursop, because you're dealing with countries as large as Colombia with 51 million people who can afford to have that sort of largesse in their response to receiving unprecedented flows from Venezuela, or yet again, countries like Brazil with over 200 million people. So I think we have to be very cautious in terms of when we look at articles comparing the responses. Trinidad figures prominently in the discussions, of course, in terms of the overall numbers of refugees from Venezuela going to neighboring countries. But it's very, very unfair, and I think it's a little bit difficult to compare and contrast when we have way more finite resources. And every country has finite resources, they're not endless. But we're dealing with small size, and if we come back again to regulating migration, this is what proper migration policy does, with the assistance, with the technical assistance of the IOM to guide, because you can then institute a quota system, particularly for smaller countries such as ours, where obviously you cannot have indefinite flows of people coming into your shores. So I just want to leave it there in terms of my preliminary statement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rice, for your contribution. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Hussein to address to comment on what has been shared so far. Dr. Hussein? Dr. Hussein? Okay, it looks like he may have stepped away. So next, I'd like to invite Dr. Gonzalez to comment on what has been said. Dr. Gonzalez. Good evening.
Yes, thank you very much, Christian. And let me thank the two presenters. I really enjoyed the two presentations. They were, of course, different. One was more conceptual, theoretical, and the other one was oriented towards looking at the history and drawing lessons from the history. Now, maybe it may be useful for me to start with the second presentation, because I think I need a little more time to absorb Richard's presentation. Richard's presentation is a model with a lot of ramifications, and I'm not sure I fully grasp all the concepts he has in there. I would say to him that, like Michelle said, the question of identity needs to be fleshed out a bit more. If you take the United States over the years has been an immigrant society, and it has been absorbing immigrants. As diverse as it is, but there, of course, a kind of mainstream identity, if you wish, which has to do with the dominance of the Anglo-Saxons. It was not until the Second World War, towards the beginning of the Second World War, that where you see Americans emerging out as a clear English-speaking Anglo-Saxon society, because the German part of America was very, very strong, and the German part was contending with the Anglo-Saxon part. But they managed to forge an Anglo-Saxon society, and it is clear that to become American, you have to learn American. They do not make any concession whatsoever to a foreign language. I mean, look at the size of the Latin population in the United States. I've always marveled at this. You have about 13% of the population, but there's no concession officially to the Latin language, to the Spanish language. So they are clearly about what they want to be about. They want to be an English-speaking society with these Anglo-Saxon values, and that if you don't conform to that, you can leave. You can come and you be absorbed into that system. Over time, they will help to, assist you to do that, and you become an American over a number of years. And you know, a lot of the identity that migrants assumed in the United States came through their military service. They had a lot of them, for instance, like the Irish and so forth. They were, in a sense, forged. They were forced, in a sense, to serve in the military in order to become American. And this, in a way, they were able to stamp their identity on the migrants. But I would say that it's an interesting model. I think certainly in the case of a place like Trinidad and Tobago, we are still a young society, as Michelle said. We are not trying to forge a proper identity here. We are not very nationalistic, and that is because of the competing cultures in a way. And we lack that social cohesion, like the Americans, where there's a clear dominant culture. And as a result, you know, we have doubts as to exactly who we are. We have one section say we are like this, another section say we are like that. And we don't know exactly how the migrants are going to fit. We tend to believe that we are multicultural and we are diverse, and something is good about that. And I must say that there are, coming out of that, there is some kind of basic acceptance of a common set of values in this plural society. We seem to believe that it's good to be democratic. We inherited the British system, and we feel that there's something good about that, and we want to try and keep that. We've inherited the British colonial education system, and we value that. We also, in a way, across all groups, we tend to accept that. And yeah, it's essentially a kind, law and order, the importance of law and order and the rule of law. That is critical in our system, and it transcends all particular groups. So there's a common set of values. I don't know if that is enough to constitute a culture and an identity, as Richard said. But I think there's that in the country, but we're still evolving in the sense of having a very, very strong identity and a strong ideological orientation as to who we are. But I would leave it at that. I tend to feel that in some way we believe that when people come, we will respect their cultures. They would come in and they would set up themselves and they can practice freely. We would tolerate whatever they bring. But over time, we would just emerge into something which we will all accept. And they will accept the common part of the society, the common culture. And that over time, everything would evolve positively. I'm not sure exactly how that is going to work. I think time will tell basically how we resolve all of these things. But I do appreciate the point he's making, which is that how do you really accept migration when it is difficult for you to know exactly where you're going and how you want these migrants to integrate in the society. I think we have to be a bit clearer about this as to exactly where we want the migrants to go. Now, leaving that, I would say, and linking that to some extent to what Michelle said, I agree with her historical account of the arrival of Venezuelans here in Trinidad, and also to, inversely, Trinidadians going to Venezuela. I would, however, say that I think this period is somewhat very unique and very different from the past. We have never seen such high levels of Venezuelan migrants. We have never seen this particular kind of migrant, which has to do with what you may call rural poor Venezuelans. And it's something which is quite different, and it has certainly different implications. I was looking today at the difference between Peru and Colombia, and the author was trying to show that where Colombia succeeded as against Peru, Peru, as you know, was very welcoming, and they allowed almost a million Venezuelans, about 800,000 Venezuelans to come in. They welcomed them, they gave them jobs and so forth. And then around 2018, 2019, they started to change, and they started to reject them. The whole society turned against them, and the government introduced all types of restrictions. They closed the borders, they started deporting them, and Venezuelans no longer see any benefit in going to Peru. As compared to Colombia, you find that Colombia has a very welcoming climate, and there's a lot of solidarity with Venezuelans. And the reason the author thinks that is due to the historical factor, which Michel to some extent is alluding to in our case. That is to say, Colombians have always gone, millions of Colombians have gone to Venezuela, all in the 70s. They were there getting jobs, and they are accustomed to Venezuelans, as well as the border contacts that they have all in the West there. And they tend to be very sympathetic and empathize with the condition of Venezuelans. So they're very open. And this, to some extent, is the reason why the Colombian government could recently decide on that new policy of regularizing over a million or over a million Colombians. It's a very drastic policy and a very difficult. I mean, Angela Merkel did something like that in a very, very radical move and survived to some extent. But Colombians, in a way, understand the condition of Venezuelans. They themselves experienced the same thing years ago. And they tend to feel that it is their turn now to try to help Venezuelans and provide for them in some way. So the historical times that they have had over the years creates that kind of bonding, which the author suggests that you do not have in the case of Peru. Now, I was trying to relate that to what Michel was saying about our historical ties with Venezuela. I think there is something there. For instance, you'd find that people I find generally have been very open and sympathetic to Venezuelans, or particularly in the southern part of Trinidad, where you find that they have been accustomed to them in the Cedros region and so forth. They have welcomed them, they have provided for them in their homes and things like that. There are no disturbances. We do not read about people being attacked on the streets and having very difficulty coming. Of course, there are individual little sporadic incidents and so forth, but by and large, there are no real basic structural problems. So that there is something to the history, I think, which has caused things to work reasonably well so far. I don't know to what extent we can rely on that, because what happens, as they showed in the case of Peru, is that after the second wave, you had three waves. The first wave, where there were a lot of the sort of aristocrats, the wealthy people coming and so forth. Then the second wave was essentially the middle class, the professional people. But the third wave of the poor people, when they started to flood Peru, then is where things started to change, and people felt that they were going to lose their jobs. They saw the Venezuelans as responsible for crime and so forth. Now, I'm not sure in the case of Trinidad, and here's where I'm asking myself, basically, if we are subjected to another wave of another 20,000 coming in. If things don't go well in Venezuela this year, and we see on our shores another 20,000 coming, would that fundamentally change our attitude towards Venezuela? I think we have to ask ourselves this question. Given the economic conditions in this country at this particular point in time, I'm not sure historical ties would serve us to the same extent. But basically, these are some of the comments I want to make at this point. I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I need to reflect a little more on some of what was said. I've taken some notes here, and I hope to probably come back and make some comments later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Tiwari to give his comments. Dr. Tiwari. Sorry, Dr. Tiwari, you have to unmute your mic because we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor again to be here. I want to say to Major Lynch and Dr. Rice that I was extremely impressed with their presentations. They started from different perspectives, but the two presentations connected very well, I thought. I want to say to Major Lynch that I know Ambassador Spencer very well, and I've had opportunity to interact with him on many occasions, both as ambassador now and as head of the military when he was here. And I find him a very thoughtful and insightful person. And if that model that you had was his, I am sure that he put a lot of thought into it. I like the idea of, I cannot fault the idea of migration strategy and policy being located in the context of development strategy. And I think both Major Lynch and Dr. Rice emphasized that. And I want to say that I am at one with them on that. I don't see how you can have a migration policy without knowing very clearly what your developmental strategy is and how your migration strategy is going to fit into that or influence the outcome of your development strategy. The second issue that was raised, there were many issues raised, but the second issue that was raised, and again touched by Dr. Lynch after it was raised by Dr. Rice after it was raised by Major Lynch, is the issue of identity and the culture. And Major Lynch talked about the cultural aspect of the identity of the state. He mentioned some states. I won't go into that, but he mentioned the cultural aspect of the identity of the state. And I think I heard him say this, I might be wrong. I think he said the idea of who a country is in the context of identity. And I think he might have used the word who in order to emphasize the sense of personality that might evolve from a state of people and nations seeing themselves in a certain way. So I might be wrong about that, but I did take that out of it. And he mentioned also the idea of migration, integration, and development. I also want to say that I agree with this, which is that unless you have an active policy of locating migration strategy in the context of development, and unless you have an interventionist approach to the business of migration, integration, sorry, I think you are unlikely to be as successful as you can be in getting your society together with the immigrants coming in to cohere. And he made a very important point, which is that at the beginning, he talked about enduring interest. And then he talked about things like COVID and the breakdown of what you might call reasonable order in Venezuela, in which he posited against enduring interests of a country or a state, the enduring threats that could come either from as a health pandemic or as a situation of political turmoil. I was particularly impressed with Dr. Rice making the simple comment, almost in passing, that on all of these important matters of identity, of multiculturalism, etc., there is relatively no discussion on these matters of any seriousness. And I agree with her. We don't want to talk about these things in any meaningful way. We talk about them superficially, but we don't talk about them in any meaningful way. I listened carefully to her 7 waves of migration. Trinidad and Tobago as a pole of attraction because it is easy to blend in. I think that there's some truth to that. And she raised the issue of identity as a very complex issue, which we all know that to be. So I would say, I mean, this was really an opportunity for these 2 presenters to present their point of view. And I really feel enriched by their presentation. I share in a lot of the perspectives outlined, and I really feel that they, what can I say, stimulated they laid the platform, the groundwork for a rich discussion this evening. I would only add a couple of things to what they said. And the first one is this, which is that the whole Americas, the entire American continent has been a place of what Naipaul calls the mingling of peoples. You had the indigenous Amerindians here in the Western Hemisphere. In the New World, as we called it then, or it was referred to then. And then you had both voluntary and forced migration through the imperial process to satisfy the requirements of the plantation economy. So you had imperialists who became settlers. You had enslaved peoples who came as well. And of course, you had the Amerindians, whose place it was, and who these migrating peoples, both freely and enforced, encountered. And that has been written about as basically the settlement in the New World of 3 culture spheres, what they call Indo-America, Afro-America, and Euro-America. And of course, with the later migration from the 19th century, whether it was indenture like in Trinidad and Tobago, or whether it was the movement of Jews from Eastern Europe and other peoples from various places to the Americas, you had this continuous, you had these settled culture spheres at first, and then you had with migration, the mingling of people. So that the simple point I want to make from that is that the Americas has always been a place of migration. It was a place that people migrated to. And then you had migration within the Americas. And that has continued for some time. And I think that you have to see what is happening with Venezuela now, not only as part of the history of waves of migration that Dr. Rice talked about, but you also have to see it as the continuing migratory patterns of the movement of people and the mingling of peoples in the Americas. And I don't think that there is anything that we can do about it except to manage it. And Trinidad and Tobago has had its own experience, some of which was spoken about here tonight. And I think that we in Trinidad and Tobago have an obligation and a responsibility to try to manage that. The tragedy of our situation is that we do not have any serious development strategy, either for Trinidad and Tobago, nor for the Caribbean as a whole. And therefore, we have a missing ingredient so that we cannot really locate that migration influx and the way we manage that into a serious and coherent development strategy, either for the region or for Trinidad and Tobago. We may claim to have a development strategy. We may claim to have a perspective on development. We may claim to have a plan, but we do not in reality. And I think the evidence to bear this out is legion. And we can pull it out from everywhere to show that it really does not exist, because we proceed in this haphazard way, in this cycle from election to election, without a strategy for the region or a strategy for individual countries. So I just wanted to mention the big migration issues in relation to the hemisphere and to locate what was happening from one country to another within that larger pattern that is historical in nature, and to locate the Venezuelan migration now because of the development issues in Venezuela in that context, against that big background. And I want to close on this, which is that generally people emigrate because in the places where they live, development policies have failed. And that is certainly the case in Venezuela. And then they migrate to places because they find something attractive there. Maybe it is attractive personally. Maybe there's some connector there, like somebody they know, family, etc., but also because of economic opportunities. And I don't think that that pattern is going to change for a long time to come. And I want to simply close with one number I have, which is that developing countries host more than 1/3 of the international migrants in the world. So that it is not simply an issue of people from developing countries going to developed countries, so-called, that is to say more industrialized countries. And there is a lot of that because 2/3 of them are there. But I don't think we should underestimate the fact that 1/3 of all international migrants actually migrate to other developing countries. So it is something that we want to bear in mind as we look at the Venezuela situation. So thank you for the opportunity to comment. Again, I was very impressed. And thank you for the opportunity to say a few words.
You're very welcome, Dr. Tiwari. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Hussein to share his comments. Dr. Hussein? All right, Dr. Hussein, we need you to unmute your mic.
Thank you very much.
Lovely.
Yeah, very good, lovely perspective. And I listened to Richard and Michelle. I was speaking to one of my other friends, Roel, today, Rolex, and he told me that Richard was amazed.
Dr. Hussein? I think Dr. Hussein's internet is giving some trouble. Okay, so we'll just give an opportunity to Dr. Gonzalez. Would you like to share on what has been the additional comments by Dr. Tiwari?
Christian, we can also take some questions from the audience as well. While
Yeah.
Dr. Hussein's.
Okay, Dr. Hussein?
Yeah.
I think.
Dr.
Okay,
Hussein,
so
you have to
we're
unmute
not-
your mic.
Yes, please, yeah.
Sorry, one of the things I was saying is that I thought I heard Michelle mention. So let me backtrack a little because I'm not sure if Richard heard my comment when I said I was very impressed when I heard he was a major in the army. So someone told me that today, and I was, I love to hear these type of stories, and well done, Richard. And so you bring a lot to the table. Michelle, if I heard correctly, you said in 2017 you did a background paper on
Early 2000s.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So there would have been two studies. One that looked at Venezuelan student migration to Trinidad and Tobago, and one that looked at the overall context of Venezuelans coming in under the then Chavez government.
So I lost half of the sentence. Can you please repeat? Sorry about that.
Sorry. So there were two different studies. One that looked at Venezuelan student migration to Trinidad in the 1990s. And the other one was in the early 2000s that looked at the overall context for migration under the Chavez era.
Excellent. So I suppose Professor Gonzalez would liaise with you to get a copy of those. We would be happy to look at them.
I could just send it to you.
If you post it on the discussion group that you are part of, yes, that would be excellent. Now,
Okay.
one of the concerns I have, and I would show it out for both of you all, as well as Dr. Gonzalez, Professor Gonzalez and Dr. Tiwari, is something that I raise on each of these seminars. So I think Dr. Tiwari, it was, or Prof. Gonzalez mentioned, a further 20,000 Venezuelans. Up until today, I lectured to my postgraduate student on a model that I am building with the Venezuelans based on a paper on 2013 that Bowen and Wood did. And the more I get into this thing, and I do this, I am looking at this thing almost 12 hours a day, every day for the last 3 months. And the more I get into it, the more I get worried about the capital to labor ratio in the non-tradable sector. As I am seeing now, where I am, I bought a property recently, and from where I am to get to the property, I have to take a short walk that probably takes me about 8 minutes, and I passed by 30 houses. And in the process of moving from here to there, in the last 3 months, I am seeing so many new Venezuelan faces in the heart of Gasparilla now. Maybe I lived in a skewed community. But then today I went to Pinal in Anand's low price supermarket, some type of name like that. And I see Venezuelans shopping, I see them selling, I see them standing outside, for lack of a better word, what I would say gaping. And I just am seeing more and more Venezuelans, and I am concerned that the capital to labor ratio is being overwhelmed past the point what economists ratio. And I would like to hear what Richard and Michelle has to say about that, as well as the other discussants in terms of that particular point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussein. So I'd like to invite Dr. Rice to begin addressing the question.
Okay. Well, I can't address it from an economic point of view. I'm not an economics focused person, but certainly if you think of 20,000 and upwards of 20,000 plus people, plus Venezuelans, coming in simultaneously while flows continue to come in from other parts of the Americas, right? Because they're not the only people who are arriving here, but certainly the most visible right now. I think in almost every corner of Trinidad and Tobago, wherever you go, you can see a very visible presence, right? They also, I see them in the groceries, and sometimes they look like us, so it's very difficult. It's only when you speak to somebody, you hear an accent, or they tell you, quite frankly, they tell you no English, right? And you have to switch to, I speak Spanish, so I could switch and speak to them. But the idea that 20,000 plus people, if we receive 20,000 plus people, I think we're going to see some serious pushback. By and large, people have been very tolerant. And I'm not talking about the kinds of things that you see negative sentiment on social media, but by and large, people have been absorbed here, and it has not posed too much of a dislocation, right? I think this is where the migration policy is necessary. But even before we talk about the migration policy, I would talk about our duty. Dr. Tiwari mentioned obligation, and obligation is the correct word, because we signed on to the Convention on the Status of Refugees almost 21 years ago. And we haven't amended our legislation, nor have we put anything in place formally in terms of clearly demarcated steps and procedures to be able to manage refugees. And we have a duty to them because we've signed on to the convention, but nothing has been ratified. So this is where that, in conjunction with a proper migration policy, will help in some way deal with how we cater to these surplus or excess flows, because we cannot entertain a huge number of people. We cannot entertain, imagine if we get 100,000 or up to 100,000 Venezuelan migrants here, when some of the other larger countries are receiving 300,000. We only have a population of just under 1.4 million. So I think that is where it's going to become critical. And I think this is where your evidence-based strategies come in. And this is where we need the figures, where we need access to the current figures. So we know this is what we can manage, and this is how it will be managed. And these are things that can be done. And that can be done with the assistance of the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, which has a presence here. Their objective is to support the development of comprehensive and evidence-based migration policies and legislation in line with international norms and standards, but taking into account your country's resources, demographics, the size of the country, and so on, and other indicators as well. So that's all I have to say on the matter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. Now, Major Lynch,
yes.
I would like you to comment. I do want you to comment, but I have an interesting question here from one of our audience members. So I'll throw that out, and then I will let you comment and the other panelists comment. So perhaps in your comment, you can include an answer to this question. So I have a question here from a Bridget Gopal. It says, as education is the way out of the poverty trap, what steps do you think must be taken to ensure quality education for the migrants in order to make them productive members of society? Okay. So,
well, if I could address first the issue that Roger raised, I think I'm back to the whole question of a model for development of Trinidad and Tobago. I think the question of appropriating migrant labor is tied to the issue of both the complementarity between skills of migrants, inherent skills that they come with, and labor shortages. I remember some years ago, Dr. Tiwari was a key champion of sectors, growth sectors. I recall him very specifically. And the extent to which we take a sectoral approach to development, I think it's important with the intent to move towards our participation in a global economy on the basis of competitiveness, would strongly suggest that an approach to migrant labor and the extent to which migrant labor is located within our developmental framework must be sectoral in approach. Now, that perhaps ties into the question that was asked about education. I mean, what are you educating migrants towards? And then the broader sense of what type of education are we speaking about? Are we speaking specifically in the context of skills in relation to labor, or a broader sense of education to which I subscribe to, and that is the extent to which education is producing a particular type of citizenry, tied to questions of values and principles, again, back to the whole question of the ideology and identity of who we are as a society. So in attempting to merge the two, I think you cannot escape the question of development from a sectoral perspective and the extent to which you are locating and appropriating migrant labor within that context. And secondly, the pursuit of education should be within a broader context of what type of migrant/naturalized citizen we are in pursuit of. And what are the institutional frameworks that will allow for that? And how are these institutions going to be provided with the instruments and resources to be able to pursue those strategic imperatives? I don't think we could escape that type of governance and public policy approach to it if we want to treat it in the sustainability that is required on the basis of how enduring this threat will be for us as a country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Lynch. Next, I'd just like to invite Dr. Gonzalez to jump in here.
Yes, thank you, Christian. Let me first deal with Roger's point about the capital labor ratio. We have been having this discussion for quite a while, and we have a slight difference on this issue. My feeling is that a lot will depend on how we succeed in our development in the years ahead. That is the extent to which we keep
Dr. Gonzalez. Okay, I think Dr. Gonzalez is having some trouble. So everyone, what I will do, we have an additional question in our chat box. So I will ask the question and then I will invite Dr. Tiwari to give his comments. And then we will begin to invite closing remarks from our panel. Hopefully by that time we'll have Dr. Gonzalez back with us. Okay, so the question that we have in the chat from a Patricia McGraw is that emerging infectious diseases, vector-borne diseases, along with poor land management and the challenges associated with securing our coastal borders could become major health issues throughout the Caribbean. And she wonders whether or not these factors have been considered. So I'd just like to invite Dr. Tiwari to jump in at this point.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to say something again. On the particular question by Ms. Magor, I really don't know if they have been taken into account as seriously as they should, but I think all of us in this region and small islands as we are, open borders to everything traveling, including infectious diseases. I think we have to be much more alert to what the major identified as enduring threats, you know, and it really is an issue of managing risk. We have to look at this business of how do you, in a small island and interconnected islands in which people travel freely and in which you engage all the time, and these are tourist destinations, etc. And you have natural situations in which mosquitoes and other insects breed. You also have those kinds of things. I mean, how do you manage these threats? So this business of risk management is an important issue. I just want to point out that the whole COVID matter is really an issue of the industrialized world's failure to manage risk, because it was known that something like COVID could happen.
Yeah.
And we knew about 10 years in advance, and people were talking about it. And the Obama administration had raised the issue. Bill Gates had raised the issue. Forget his first name now, but Taleb, who had written the book, The Black Swan, had in fact mentioned this as a possibility. So this was not a black swan event. It was a risk that needed to be managed, and it was horrendously managed. So we in the Caribbean, we need to manage what are our risks. We need to identify them and say, these are our 10 biggest risks. And we set about the security system, the anticipatory system, etc. I'm sure the major will agree with me on this, in which you deal with that particular issue. And you can't do it hoping that nothing will happen. You have to be prepared like if something is going to happen tomorrow. And that is what preparation is about. I just want to say one more thing, and it's in relation to Roger's issue about the labor and basically where the labor of migrants, where the labor flows in terms of the nature of the economy. And I've been reading something which is a report from the OECD Development Center and the ILO. So it's a combined paper by these two groups. And this is what it says. It says that a policy framework and strategic deployment of migrants as they come into the destination country are very critical for development gains. Okay, in other words, the process has to be managed. And I have a direct quote here, which I took down, which Roger might be interested in, Dr. Hussein. And this is the quote: a large informal economy associated with weak labor migration capacities and a lack of labor market policies prevent many destination countries from making the most of immigration flows. Okay, so I simply share that with you in this round.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. Tiwari. So,
yes,
yes,
Christian, can I just continue from where I left off? I got cut off. Yes, I have a problem of connection here. No, I was saying that the problem that we are facing with labor really stems from the fact that we have not been able to move up the development ladder. That is, we have been stuck where we are as a commodity producer, and we have not diversified enough. And the extent to which we are able to climb that ladder and go into more higher valued goods, producing for export, develop a competitive tradable sector, we may find that the labor coming from Venezuela is very complementary. That is to say, it may be more unskilled, and we would have here a more skilled set of labor. As you know, over the years, we have been absorbing unskilled labor here. It's nothing new, simply because of the fact that we have had our education system producing more skilled Trinidadians who are seeking higher value jobs. So it means that the Venezuelans would largely be going into that informal sector that Roger speaks about. And today I was able to see, for instance, in the case of Peru, where there's an informal sector as high as 73% of the economy. And most of the Venezuelans went into there. I guess it reached a saturation point, and this is probably what caused the backlash. But the point I want to make here is that remember that a lot of these migrants are coming on a temporary basis and they're seeking for opportunities. If they don't find any opportunities, they will move on. They will move back to Venezuela, they'll move to other destinations, as we have seen with people from the rest of the Caribbean. So it's only if there are opportunities for them that they're likely to hang around and try to exploit those opportunities. Now, as I was saying, if the labor complements our labor here, then to a large extent, everybody benefits. Our labor will go towards a higher wage. That is, the native labor will go up to a higher wage, and their labor will come in at the existing wage, and it will benefit from the need for that labor. Now, I was looking at some figures. I think it was for Colombia, and they were suggesting that 43% of the Venezuelan labor goes into the informal sector. And they are largely the kind of unskilled people working in bars, restaurants, casinos, and that sort of thing, in the retail trade to some extent and so forth. And this is largely, I think, what we may see. I don't have the figure for this country, but I would suspect that it's more or less the same. But I'm hopeful that we do get a strategy going. We do get the capital, and it largely depends, in my view, not so much on the labor, but it largely depends on capital. If you could find investors, right? And Trinidad is a fair amount of capital. From over the years, we have accumulated a fair amount of capital in the country. If you could find the capital to invest and diversify the country and push it along, or push it higher on that curve, then you would find that, for instance, the labor would be absorbed. So I don't have the same fears as Roger, and I always point out that there's a limit to which the informal sector would grow here in these circumstances, insofar as the government impact on the economy would be much less, because they don't have the kind of revenue from the energy sector that they used to enjoy. And as a result, you would find that the demand for a lot of the things in the informal sector that we saw before would not be there. So I'm not too concerned about the fact that the informals, that Venezuelans may crowd out local unskilled labor, and that may create some kind of backlash. Except I would say that in the short run, we may have a problem if there's that kind of dislocation, which we're seeing to some extent now with all the layoffs and so forth. If we are not able to overcome that kind of short run difficulty that we're having, we could see some kind of crisis, if you wish, some kind of friction that could possibly take place. And that could certainly be compounded if you have a next huge wave of Venezuelans coming upon us, and we are forced to try to accommodate them. But that's what I would say basically about this question of Venezuelan labor. I wanted just to ask Richard if he could elaborate a little more on the question of the enduring interests of the state. I was trying to link that question of the enduring interests of the state with identity and ideology. Because I was trying to understand, for example, if a state has a strong identity and a strong culture, if the country, let's say, has a strong identity and a strong culture, does that not imply to some extent that you're going to have a strong state with a strong governance system and so forth? What are the implications if the identity is not very strong, and if it lacks any clear ideological orientation where it is going? What are the implications of that for what you call the enduring interests of the state? Could you just go a little further on that and clarify things? Good, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, just one moment, please, Major Lynch. So we'd just like to invite Major Lynch and Dr. Rice to give their closing remarks. Major Lynch, you will go first, and then we'll have Dr. Rice.
Yeah. Okay, well, in my closing remarks, I will try to respond to Dr. Gonzalez's question in that regard. Inherent in any developed national ideology and identity is essentially a set of values and a sense of what is important to the state. Within that frame, whatever you value, you have a particular enduring interest to sustain. I often say, I mean, I've grown up in the military. We have to be clear on what are the enduring interests of the state that we are prepared to defend and or secure. Why is that important? It's important because not every interest is necessarily enduring. But if we arrive at a certain level of national identity and ideology, it defines what are our interests. Now, our enduring interests are not only national in that sense. Our participation in the global system should be informed by how we pursue those enduring interests that are defined by our identity and our ideology, that then informs what our foreign policy framework and strategy is going to look like. So it's a quite complementary relationship between who we see ourselves to be and why we see ourselves this way, and what are the levels of our interests, or what are our interests in that sense. And then the question of how do we pursue it or defend and or secure it is a matter of policy and strategy. All right. Let me use one classic example. If we see ourselves to be, by identity or ideology, a multicultural society, then one of the enduring interests of the state is actually a question of tolerance, mutual respect, and the extent to which that transforms into a certain level of coherence in terms of the way we exist in society. I'm sure we are all quite aware of countries who have a kind of demographic that we have, that have not been able to ensure its enduring interest for peace and coherence in the society. That has led to all kinds of problems. And many of them are close neighbors of ours, which I wouldn't choose to refer to specifically at this moment. But it is a testimony exactly to the extent to which we are able to operate with a certain level of the enduring interest of peace, peaceful coexistence in such a diverse society, unlike some of our close neighbors. And that speaks to where on the continuum of national identity and ideology we are in relation to being able to manage one of our clearly defined enduring interests, and that is coexistence. There are many others that perhaps we could flesh out going forward, but as it's my closing remarks, I want to reemphasize the question of migration, or even labor migration, migrant labor policies, has to be rooted in a clear vision of national identity and ideology, a clear plan, a clear strategy of where we are going. And that is essentially a political process, not necessarily party political, but the process by which we as a society are prepared to arrive at some coherent sense of who we are and where we are going, and the extent to which migration fits into that development strategy, I think is an important pillar of treating with all of these different elements, whether it's a labor capital issue or other aspects of labor migrant integration into the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Lynch. And next we'll have Dr. Rice with the last word. Dr. Rice?
Okay, I just want to sum up looking at the issue of resources. We had two questions asked about health, the health sector and the education sector. And basically some of the pushback that Peter alluded to, which we could very well face if we have larger continued flows, is the whole issue of resources. Why do people in the constituent population react with xenophobic statements? Well, the three of the most important damning things could be competition for jobs. If there's a perception that Venezuelans are coming in and taking our jobs, we see ads going out in Spanish because people know exactly who they want to capture, what demographic they want. They want migrant labor, Spanish-speaking migrant labor, even at the cost of not even speaking English. So that speaks something. I think it speaks volumes in terms of work ethic, because migrants strive to do better than they were doing in their home population. So you're not going to migrate, especially under difficult circumstances, to then do worse or to perform even worse than you did previously. So I think to a large extent, and that is the informal economy that we've been talking about, Venezuelans have been absorbing, by and large, the jobs that Trinidadians no longer want to do. That's plain and simple. Even without having access to the statistics, we see it on a day-to-day basis in terms of the places we go, whether it's in services industry, restaurants, bars. I frequented 2 establishments within 3 days, and they were all entirely run by Venezuelans. So that's another reality, right? We've come to a sort of a New York situation or a California situation where you have Mexican migrants and Hispanic migrants occupying certain jobs that Americans don't want to do. And we've had that. The question is now, with the pandemic, will that change if we have an influx of 20, 30, 40,000 people who no longer can find those lower paying jobs? On the issue of health, this again, and it's all related, this is why you want to regularize migrants and manage your flows. Because as we saw with the registration process, one of the things that they had were doctors on hand to identify what were the health issues of the migrants who were registered. And so this allows you then to ensure that you don't have problems with vector-borne diseases, non-communicable diseases, and so on. And this has to be done because within the last decade or so, we would have seen things like malaria, which is not endemic to Trinidad and Tobago. Suddenly you have a few cases popping up, most of which were attributed to either Venezuelan or Guyanese migrants. So this is why migration policy, and at least in the absence of a migration policy, a formal procedure for registering migrants and treating with migrants is important, because it allows you to manage your health sector. With respect to education, the Prime Minister took a stance that denominational schools could absorb, in schools that had room, absorb some of the migrant children, and then that process was reversed. So with the assistance of UNICEF, there were grants to have child-friendly spaces, you can't call them schools, and those children were receiving education, which, by the way, is their right, not a privilege, right, in terms of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those resources where those children had access to education or some form of education has now stopped entirely because of the pandemic. Why? Because there's no more face-to-face classes, and most of them will not be able to access online learning. They don't have an online platform. There's nothing set up formally for them to continue their education. So that already poses a very serious problem. And up to May of last year, 12% of that registered population of migrants from Venezuela were children between the ages of 5 and 17. So children of school age. So we have to be concerned that there's a large migrant population with young children who don't have access to education. So I just want to close with that in terms of how we manage resources. That's what migration is. We talked about managing risk, and you don't want the risk of people not being integrated, people not having access to some of the basic services that your native population has. And I just want to end with this last statement. We talked about having a strong identity. Perhaps what has worked in our favor in terms of all the groups of people who have come here, who have assimilated, who have blended in, who have made their lives, is the fact that we don't have a strong identity. So then this allows you to fit into whatever you want to fit into. A little enclave here of Venezuelan people who speak Spanish, who manage among themselves, or areas where there's a very large we like to say small island population, right? Small islanders, and you can find those pockets everywhere. So perhaps we, maybe not having a strong state identity has worked in our favor thus far. And I'm not saying it's going to work forever, but because we've had this sort of ad hoc approach to people coming in and not really seeking to have some sort of integration process, people have found a way on their own. Maybe this has to a large extent assisted us with settling, different groups settling, by and large with us peacefully cohering. The future, of course, we have a lot of question marks, and obviously we need to have some sort of managed strategy in terms of dealing with all of the things that we mentioned here, particularly for irregular migrants, because it is in the long term going to, and I think we're already starting to see some of the effects short term, but we have to be able to anticipate what is going to happen in the next year or two, and how do we manage increasing numbers. And I just want to end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rice. I believe Major Lynch has one comment that he wants to add, and then we will wrap up.
Thank you. I want to reemphasize the importance of the multidimensionality of threats that we face in Trinidad and Tobago at this point. And to say that they are by and large requiring us to renegotiate and re-navigate our relationship with the state quite a lot. We are a society, for good or bad, quite accustomed to a lot of individual liberty that we've exercised, as we've described in our evolution of who we are as a society. But when you begin to think about the multidimensionality of the threats that we are facing today, whether it's cybersecurity, and that's another story entirely by itself, and the extent to which we arrive at virtual sovereignty and we transform this culture of this society to interpret information as national assets that need to be secure and or defended virtually, or the question of migrants, or more so the question of security and the types of security that ensures not only the integration of migrants into the society, but the protection of our existing citizens from some of the interactive dynamics that we are speaking of here. It is requiring a renegotiation and navigation of this relationship between the security of the collective and the individual liberty of both citizens as well as migrants. And I don't know that there is a formula, one fits all, because this is a dynamic reality. And so it requires, it's much of an art as a science in terms of what the figures tell us, to be able to manage and negotiate a new balance or new contract, given what we are treating with. So I just thought I'd put that out there, because when you locate migrants within that framework, it's along an evolutionary line of multidimensional threats that requires the kind of leadership that is going to steer us through this complex reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Major Lynch. And thank you very much to our panel, Dr. Rice, Major Lynch, and the comments by Dr. Tiwari, Dr. Gonzalez, and Dr. Hussein. We at TDU really appreciate your contributions to a very rich and engaging discussion this evening. And we just want to thank you all for your participation. And last but not least, we do appreciate you, our audience, for your questions, for your participation in this evening's discussion. So everyone, I'd just like to wish you all a very good evening. Remember to socially distance, to keep wearing your masks, and to take all the necessary precautions to continue our successful fight against COVID-19. Thank you, everyone, and do have a good evening.